You're listening to the Enterprise Architecture Experience, a brand new podcast about enterprise architecture with practical examples and expert insights into the reality of making enterprise architecture work in your business. I'm John Hill, and every week I'll be joined by Hassan Abba. So this week our primary topic is talking about frames of reference, and this is something that you introduced to me, Hassan, as a concept of a way of looking at the world, and I kind of quite like it. So do you want to just, at a very high level, just explain what we're talking about when we're talking about frames of reference?
Yeah, the idea of frames of reference is to do with abstraction, and when we're talking of information technologies and technologies that we work with as architects, there are many abstract layers and concepts in that. Let's take the example of building architecture that we are all familiar with. Okay, if I open up a map of St. Paul's Cathedral and I show that to anyone, they will easily be able to understand where the doors are, where the windows are, what the walls are, where they are, all that very intuitively, even though they might not understand architecture, right? The same if I look at the Taj Mahal or the blueprint of the Taj Mahal, it would be the same thing. And the reason why that is because all of us, we have a common frame of reference, and that frame of reference might be as simple as what's a door, what's a window, what's a wall.
So we know, we know what it is that you're talking about on the plan. When you say there's a window here, we know what a window is.
Exactly. And we can mentally take ourselves to that place very quickly. And what that means is that's a very easy conversation that can be had between the person and the architect, for example, right? The problem with IT is there is no fixed frame of reference.
Yeah.
So let me give you an example of IT. If I want to integrate two systems together, I need to introduce what is a system, what are two things I'm trying to integrate together. It might be as simple as that. Now extrapolate that over hundreds of different things you're trying to transform and change and so on. And then you've got different layers of complexity, from conceptual to logical to physical. So not only you have scope complexity, you have different layers of complexity you have to deal with, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I meant by frames of reference.
Yeah. Even the simple capability model, something that would say is a cornerstone of enterprise architecture. I have found it quite hard sometimes to describe that to the business, of kind of, take it away from the way you operate today and the departments that you're structured in, and think about your business as a set of capabilities. It's a hard thing to do. It's not easy, because you're having to abstract it away to something that they're not used to.
The concept of a business capability model is to be a focal point where business and IT can talk about the same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
In your experience, how have you solved that problem?
So it's a great question. I'm not sure I necessarily have, but I think the way I've tried to solve it. So early on at my time in Alvatech, we had a conversation about the finance systems and the way the finance systems were going to hang together, and I tried to introduce it early as a concept to say, hey, listen, here's a way that we can group your systems to show how they sit within loose terms of the stuff that you do. So I'm not using that. I deliberately didn't use the names of the departments, but I did use terminology that I knew was used in Alvatech to be able to say, look, these are the applications that are associated with tax. These are the applications associated with your regulatory reporting out to the markets. So and actually that was received really well, because I started the conversation with, hey, from a high level view, these are the things that you do, and we know that they don't relate directly to departments, but these are the systems that fit within it. And actually that worked quite well as a start point, and then we could debate it, and then they could say, well, actually these things all kind of sit together, and we actually refined both the systems landscape and the capability model off the back of that. So that was quite good, I think.
So John, if you remember, one of the things we tried to do is we put business capabilities to the side for the moment.
Yeah.
But what we did is we said, let's triangulate around at least 6 value streams.
Yeah.
Target discovery, drug discovery, preclinical, clinical, regulatory, and safety.
Yeah.
Because those are big enough value streams that you can have a conversation with someone with. At the same time, it was a small enough number that you could put on a page.
Yeah.
Was a good start point, because as soon as you get into business capabilities and level 1, level 2, level 3, you can very quickly lose an audience.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that, and actually people were blown away by that, because what you did that I think really resonated was turned that then into something that looked like a London Tube map of the value streams as they interacted with each other, and it really sat well with the business users. I remember getting some some very positive comments about that.
The other thing about this is it's not a new problem, right?
No.
If you think about it, and I mean, if you've read history and you look at when language was developed, or when the Sumerians in Iraq developed language, and suddenly you had to take a community who didn't have notation, who didn't have language, and then you had to impose on them language, you had to create these new abstract symbols and concepts in their minds. And that takes time. It takes a long time to embed that kind of stuff in people's minds. So it becomes part of the natural way of working.
How have you worked with your teams to get this across practically, in terms of, how do you stop them talking in architectural terms and creating those frames of reference?
What I try and do is I say, look, put yourself in the shoes of the person you're trying to talk to, and think of them as being uninitiated in understanding what you already know.
Yeah.
And then work backwards from there. And what is the gap? How can you simplify it and take it to the most abstract, salient things that you want to talk about, so that they can easily grasp it?
Yeah, very good. So here we are with our first interviewee on the Enterprise Architecture Experience podcast, and we've got with us Carl Johan Nordmark, who we all know as Kalle. So welcome, Kalle, to the podcast. Would you like to just introduce yourself for the listeners?
Thank you so much, John. Yes, my name is Carl Johan Nordmark. I'm currently working at AstraZeneca in R&D IT. I'm the head of product design and delivery, which is combined software engineering, user research and design, and engineering excellence type function.
Kalle, do you want to just tell us a bit more about your team?
Yes. My team is made up of a broad range of different skill sets. So I talk about my team having 3 major capabilities. One is obviously around software engineering. I also have a smaller team, which is all about user research and design and product management. How do we quickly iterate around problems and draw out concepts and truly understand the problems that we're trying to solve in a true user-centric way? And then the third part of my team is around engineering and product excellence. How do we drive the evolution of DevOps practices across the organization? How do we improve how we're working, and how do we ensure that we can do more with less, basically? So 3 components of my team.
Okay, and I believe the focus on your team is very much around new novel solutions.
Yes, definitely. It's all about delivering custom products, providing competitive advantage, or where there is a gap in the COTS and SaaS type solutions that we typically work with. You don't really want software engineers supporting and doing configuration of a COTS product. They want to solve hard problems in a novel way.
Can you tell us a little bit about your kind of general experience and interaction with EA?
Sure. My experience in architecture sort of goes back 20 years ago when I started to work with technical architecture in the telecommunications industry. Also focused on doing operations architecture in the same industry, then moving over to do general integration solution architecture in travel and transportation, working across Nordic healthcare companies with IT strategy and enterprise architecture. Then finally moving into the pharmaceutical industry, where I've been doing everything that we can put in the frame of what architecture is all about. It's about solution architecture, doing enterprise architecture, leading architecture teams across the entire R&D value chain, although with a focus on primarily the development part of the value chain.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. And how do you interact with the EA teams in your current role then?
Obviously, moving back into a delivery type organization, a lot of that has to do with trying to understand where should we focus our custom build efforts. Obviously, we have a limited amount of resources. We need to have an agreement. Where do we prioritize these resources? Where does it really provide competitive advantage? And that's clearly the interaction point that I'm having with the enterprise architecture team to identify those areas where we see gaps in the technology footprint, where we can do something really different, and where we need the skills and capabilities of software engineering teams to bridge that gap. That's one of the areas where I'm interacting. The other one is obviously also around how do we improve our technical sort of assurance? How do we bring in new technologies in a controlled way? And how do we keep up to date with the rapid evolvement of technologies as we see today? So pushing the EA team to be more proactive in that sense, and really look out towards the longer horizons in terms of what is needed in terms of technologies.
The other key thing on that I learned from Kalle when we were working together is doing the right things, and the enterprise architects are focused on doing the right things. The solution architecture mindset is about doing things right. You've already made your big decisions about what do you want to do, what's your direction of travel, what are the technologies you want to implement, for example, but how do you do that in the right way? And that the mindset changes and the partnership with engineering changes as a result.
And just to build on that, when you mentioned that, Hassan, I think another clear interaction we have with the enterprise architecture team is around making sure that the business context is understood. Often we see that software engineer type individuals are more focused on the technology domain versus the business domain. And we definitely use enterprise architects as the conduit to getting us an understanding what are the high level problems we try to solve within this area of the business. As an example, the enterprise architects can help us understand that in a way that bridges the technical and business language that is needed in this area. So that's another clear interaction with the enterprise architects.
Yeah, that's very cool. And then you're lucky because you have those different layers of architecture there that you can call upon. How does that work practically, Kalle? Do you ask for a specific architect, or do you kind of work with all of them knowing where their skills are? How do you transition from one layer of architecture to the next, as it were?
From my experience, I think it's all about the softer relations that you have with individuals, trying to create a framework where you map something through a decision tree to say this individual is the one I should engage. It doesn't really work like that in practice. It's all about knowing the team, knowing their expertise, and building the relationship so that you can actually cut through the layer in the most effective way. Any kind of large organization typically have a lot of layers, and I think to be effective and to get through, you need to be able to cut through the layers, and that is done using sort of point-to-point interactions and conversations, asking for help, asking for advice, and utilizing the individual strength of a team. That's where the magic happens. It's with the individual.
So, Kalle, today we are talking in the broader podcast about frames of reference and our ability to kind of contextualize enterprise architecture. You've actually already mentioned a couple of things around this, but maybe if you could expand, what are your thoughts on that contextualization, making enterprise architecture real for consumers?
It's a very good question, and very hard to answer as well, because I do think it depends on the context that you're in. Who are you having a conversation with? What's their understanding of architecture? Are they an architect, or are they a consumer of architecture services, basically? But at the end of the day, I think my frame of reference from what is enterprise architecture, it's all about the holistic viewpoint. It's about enterprise architecture and the combination of the organizational structures, their processes, the information, technology, and the people, ensuring that all of those elements are aligned with the overall business strategy. So the holistic viewpoint is one thing. Then the other thing that is fundamental to EA is that it needs to be centered around value creation. Anything but value creation in mind with an architect really becomes an overhead. It proves that we're not really getting the outputs or the achieving the impacts that we would like to see. And I think good enterprise architects are creating that value creation by aligning IT capabilities with business goals. They use enterprise architecture to optimize resources, reduce redundancies across the organization, but also drive innovation, making sure that we further propel the organizational value. So those are the key points that I consider. Then, of course, there is always a guiding framework as well, talking about, okay, what do we do in architecture? And there I'd like to talk about the kind of capabilities we need to run architecture as a business versus the kind of capabilities or the services we offer for consumption. And obviously, what we like to offer as services, we often talk about what do we do in the architecture strategy or IT strategy space. How do we do capability-based planning? And how do we do solution architecture? All of those are critical ingredients into an effective enterprise architecture team. And to help run that, then you obviously need focus on architecture excellence and assurance. You need to drive architecture standards management, definition and principles, reference architectures, and so on. But I think that is how I like to think about architecture. But I'm more focused on the holistic viewpoint centered around the problem, helping to solve that and focus on value creation. That's my frame of reference if I talk about architecture.
One of the challenge I have, and Cal has been through this as well, is what is the scope of enterprise architecture, right? How wide do you need to look at in that problem-solving space? I always have this view that how do you make yourself useful to solve business problems, right? And if you can do that really well, then you become a trusted partner to the stakeholder. So it's important, make yourself useful, then be trusted, and then you can influence. Making yourself useful means you need to be in that space where you're solving problems with the business. You cannot be in an ivory tower saying, I need to look at the whole organization and solve the problems of the whole organization because I have the word enterprise in my title, let's say, right? And that's a key thing that we try and educate our people that, look, focus on your house, get your own house in order before you try to sort of solve the whole world's problems.
Completely agree, Hassan. And I think from my perspective, and this goes back in my entire career in architecture, that I always found myself and the teams being useful if they have one foot in the business domain and the other foot in the technology domain. I think if you combine those two, you can be effective. And be a sort of a general purpose good architect if you have your foot grounded in both areas. If you're only in the business domain, then you have a hard time articulating why certain things needs to be done in a certain way. IT wants to be the decision makers and so on. If you only understand technology and not the business, then you typically have a very hard time getting a seat at the table or earning that seat at the table. But if you're grounded in both, you become that trusted advisor. You show an understanding of the problem space, where we want to drive the business forward, and that gets you that seat at the table, and you can start influence and be part of the strategic conversations.
I've often thought that enterprise architecture has a lot of parallels with business analysis, in so much as both of those disciplines are about translation, are about taking one party's opinion and translating it for another party, and being that person who sits between those two sides, between the technical and the business, and making it come together. The difference, I guess, is the EA part is you're also thinking about the future and the strategy and trying to bear all of that in mind, whereas business analysis is much more focused on a very specific problem that you're talking about at any one time. But yeah, I completely agree, Kalle. I've seen that people who are interested in both and actually probably don't have a deep knowledge of both are probably sometimes the best, because they won't go too far on either side, but be a good translator between the two, because they can see enough of the IT and enough of the business to be able to kind of put the things together, and then ultimately get the experts talking to each other if they have to get into the real detail. But I fully subscribe to Hassan's position, and I have used it as a mantra myself since working with him, which is, make yourself useful, get that seat at the table, and then start to influence. And as you're making yourself useful, help people understand what you're thinking and what you're doing that is architecture as you do that.
Completely agree. It's all about that problem solving, optimization, making yourself useful. And I think that applies to any kind of role. If you want to be influential, you need to show that you can collaborate, you can show that you want to solve a problem, and solving the problem is the most important thing, not necessarily exactly how you do it. And I think we need to remember that at all times.
One more thing I'd like to add over here. I mean, another key thing working with Kalle that I've learned or sharpened up more is this idea that don't make perfection your enemy, right? Focus on good, get something out there, show that value very early, build on it towards that sort of guiding North Star. Sometimes perfection is just a North Star. It's just a guide that you're aiming for. It doesn't have to be the thing you need to deliver, right? And that's an important factor that people need to understand, because we can always try and boil the ocean and be there forever.
Yeah, so true. So Kalle, if EA could do something for you tomorrow, if they could rock up and you could have a whole different conversation, a whole different outlook, if they could magic something out of a bag, what could EA do for you tomorrow that would add value into what you're doing?
I think that this is where the context of the current organization needs to be considered, and how we have organized enterprise architecture. Where I could definitely use more support is for the teams in enterprise architecture that are more technology oriented. What if architecture could help elevate reference architecture and patterns from slideware into working code, as an example? At this day and age, everything is code, and code accelerates work. It drives reuse and common approaches more than any written document. So I think by having architecture focus more on adoption and standardize ways of adoption rather than the explicit what, I think that would generate a lot of value across the engineering community, for sure.
There's an important context point here. We're talking about this and it feels very technology based, but bearing in mind you are the leader of a team of engineers who are delivering product, and therefore enterprise architecture in that context has to be focused on you, the customer, as part of the business, as a delivery team, about what you need in that context. So I just want to make that kind of clear here, because it might feel like we're here talking about enterprise architecture and yet here we are talking about coding and technology and this, that and the other. But actually, as you said, there's like a whole context here, which is, as a customer of enterprise architecture, you are a technology based team.
I think it's entirely right. Again, context matters, and my frame of reference in the role I am, it needs to be centered around technology. If I was in any other role, it could be the opposite. But again, architects need to be able to adapt to different frames of references, bringing us back to topic again. But that is really, really key.
Yeah.
And it's the ability to be able to have that conversation, regardless of the domain, regardless of the combination, the context, that makes architecture so effective, because they are sort of general purpose problem solver with a very holistic viewpoint and a very holistic kind of mindset.
Let's look at what does this mean. So one of the things that an architect needs to do is looking ahead to say, what does the 2025 and 2026 portfolio look like, and how are they connected together? And where are we making the right decisions? Let's say, are we buying things over here for this piece, or are we building things over here, right? And then how do you link those things together, and how do you deliver? And so in a practical nature, we need to make decisions about where do we sort of fight which battles, or where do we need to make the right decisions. So that becomes the reality of what that portfolio looks like.
And I think that brought to mind when we talked about what value could enterprise architecture bring to the work that I do today. And I think one area which is probably immature is around some kind of a value-based framework where we talk about the value of certain initiatives versus the risk versus the cost and all other dimensions. How do we create more of a data-driven approach so that we actually help and get an early view? Where should we invest our engineering resources, as an example? How do we create a framework that allows to consider the competitive advantage, the gaps we see in COTS or SaaS type solutions for a certain space, so that we know very early on where to focus the resources and the efforts. And I think that could be something where EA could do more around creating that kind of framework and that kind of value-based scoring of initiatives and so on, to make it transparent to the rest of the organization. How are we thinking?
So, thank you very much, Kalle. It's been super insightful, really useful, and hopefully we'll have you on again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jon. Thank you, Hassan. It's been a pleasure coming to the Enterprise Architecture Experience and talk about architecture and engineering.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Kalle.
Okay, so that was our interview with Carl Nordmark. So I think there was loads of good stuff came up in there, Hassan. I particularly liked what he said around, putting things in context. It's very in keeping with the theme of today's podcast.
Yeah, absolutely, Jon. And I think contextual awareness is very important. And I think that also links back to the conversation around frames of reference, because if you have a frame of reference and you have a context, then you have a very good grounding of knowing where you stand and what you're trying to do, because that's really what architects are trying to do. They need to be really good communicators so that they can articulate, because they are sitting in between the business and engineering, how to make that linkage.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that struck me was that Kalle naturally touched on the fact, on a point that you just made at the start of the podcast about, there are multiple frames of reference as well. So there's thinking about them in their team and their technical perspective, thinking about how they're going to interact with solution architects, how they want to react and have help from enterprise architects, all these different contexts that come into play. Taking the time to think that through and make that clear in those communications is very important. So I thought that was very insightful. So a funny story, Hassan, when we were waiting for you to join the call, Kalle and I were chatting, and he had said that he put into ChatGPT and asked it about frames of reference and what it could tell him about frames of reference, particularly in line with enterprise architecture. And ChatGPT came back and said it needed more context, which I thought was very funny.
That's like a loop, and that's it. It's
Exactly.
Still looping around that one.
Exactly. Even ChatGPT needs a context. And actually, what we were talking about when that happened, and we had a laugh about it, but actually, it is something people need to think about beyond architecture. In everything that everybody does, we are having to think more and more about context, and working with AI and working with generative AI. You absolutely have to think about context. And the more context you give a Gen AI, the better the result you'll get. So, I mean, there's some kind of lesson in there for us, I think.
Agreed. I fully agree. And I think, John, in my mind, I take inspiration from Steve Jobs and Apple as an example of that. I think one of the things that Steve Jobs was good at was being able to step back and put himself in the shoes of the users.
Yeah.
Right. And then work backwards into what is the engineering that needs to be done to make this as easy as possible for those users, right?
Yeah.
Which is a completely different way of thinking that an engineer would have. And the engineer would say, I've built the best product for a user, just use it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I used to work for a software house, and we were very guilty there, I believe, of writing software that was brilliant according to the developers. And then being one of the people who went on site and had to implement it. And I would come back and say, people don't use this. Why not? It's brilliant. And it was a lot of the time, interestingly, one thing that particularly sticks in my mind, it was because the developers had developed it in an interface that was very technical and very developer-like, but it just didn't resonate with scientists. So yeah, it's, I mean, I think you said this right back at the start of the podcast, but you know, the problem is as old as time.
Yes.
So here's something that came up as I was putting the edit of the interview together, Hassan, is it was interesting to me that the context of EA that we were discussing was leaping around all over the place. So I think that in itself is a good indication of the need for clarity. And I think we mentioned this on the very first podcast, is, you know, what is EA very much depends on the context. But I mean, even in this podcast going forward, we should be careful to make sure we kind of highlight when we're talking about a broader concept, a specific team, the practice of, etc., etc. So that was quite interesting, I think.
I agree, John. And I think there's two parts that you just mentioned. There's EA as a practice, and that practice has a context. The other thing is there's the enterprise architecture as an output.
Yes. Yeah.
And we need to be clear on both those things.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's wrap up the podcast. It's been really interesting, and I hope everybody out there has enjoyed the conversation. Let us know on the LinkedIn group, or drop us an email at eaexperiencepodcast@gmail.com if you've got any comments, any questions, anything you want to feedback to us. We'd love to hear from you. All that remains is for me to say thank you once again to Carl Johan Nordmark. Thanks to Hassan.
Thank you, John.
And we'll see you next time on the Enterprise Architecture Experience.